When the news spread through the Robertson circle, it did not arrive with drama or spectacle, but with the kind of silence that settles over a home when something irreversible has already happened. Phil Robertson's final days were not framed as an ending he had planned for. Even though he often spoke about faith, eternity, and what he believed came after life, those closest to him expected sorrow, of course. But what they did not anticipate was how heavy the absence would feel even before the details were fully understood. The man who had built his identity on simplicity, conviction, and resilience had gradually been stripped of the very traits that defined him. In his last months, conversations became shorter, pauses longer, and memory less reliable. Yet even in decline, there was something unmistakably firm in his presence, as though parts of him refused to dissolve completely. His family gathered around him not in preparation for a dramatic farewell, but in quiet acknowledgement that something foundational in their lives was shifting. And when he finally passed, there was no public spectacle attached to it, only the intimate gravity of a family confronting a reality they had rehearsed in thought, but never emotionally accepted. A decline marked by silence and small forgettings. The early signs of change were subtle enough that the family initially rationalized them away. A misplaced tool, a repeated question, a pause that lingered a few seconds too long before a familiar name was recalled. These were the kinds of moments that did not immediately signal catastrophe. But over time, they began to accumulate. The man who once remembered hunting seasons, scripture passages, and family histories with precision began to lose the threads of his own continuity. There were days when conversations looped back on themselves, as if time inside his mind no longer moved in a straight line. The emotional weight of watching such a transformation unfold was difficult for his children to articulate. They were used to strength, to consistency, to a father whose presence anchored the household in certainty. Now they were learning to interpret silence as communication and confusion as a form of vulnerability. Despite this, there were still flashes of recognition that cut through the uncertainty moments when laughter, instinct, or familiarity would return as if untouched. Those moments became precious, not because they lasted, but because they reminded the family of what still existed beneath the decline. The family learning to live between memory and presence as the condition progressed. The household adapted in ways that were never openly discussed but quietly understood. Roles shifted without announcement. Conversations became gentler, instructions simpler, patience more intentional. The family was no longer simply interacting with a patriarch. They were navigating the unpredictable terrain of memory loss. Yet what made this period especially complex was that Phil himself never fully relinquished his internal sense of identity. Even when details slipped away, his tone, his convictions, and his instinctive responses often remained intact. He could forget what day it was but still speak with certainty about faith or life philosophy. This contrast created a strange duality within the home, one version of him fading, another persisting. His children found themselves grieving in increments rather than in a single moment. Each small loss carried emotional weight, but none were final enough to fully resolve into acceptance. Life continued around him, but always slightly altered, as if the household itself had learned to speak more quietly in response to something fragile at its center. Conversations about faith that never lost their center even as memory faltered. Discussions about belief remained a constant thread in his life. Faith was never treated as a topic separate from identity. It was woven into how he interpreted everything, including his own decline. There were moments when he would pause mid-thought, searching for words that would not come easily, yet still manage to return to familiar conclusions about purpose, endurance, and what he believed lay beyond physical existence. His family often listened more than they responded, not out of agreement or disagreement, but because those conversations carried a sense of continuity that illness had not fully disrupted. In some ways, these exchanges became more meaningful as time went on, not because they were clearer, but because they felt distilled, stripped of excess. and reduced to core beliefs he had carried for decades. Even when sentences broke apart or drifted, the underlying conviction remained recognizable. For his children, it was both comforting and painful. Comforting because something essential still existed, and painful because they knew how much had already begun to slip beyond reach. The final days that narrowed the world down to one house as his condition advanced, the outside world gradually receded. The home became the center of all activity, care, and presence. Visits became more structured, routines more predictable, and time itself seemed to move differently within the walls of the house. The distinction between day and night softened, replaced by cycles of rest, alertness, and quiet observation. Family members rotated responsibilities, ensuring he was never alone for long periods. In these final days, communication often relied less on words and more on familiarity. Gestures, tone, and proximity became the primary forms of interaction. There was no dramatic moment signaling the final transition toward the end. Instead, there was a slow tightening of the world until it revolved almost entirely around immediate presence. Those close to him often described this time not as an ending already happening, but as a narrowing corridor in which only essential things remained visible. And within that corridor, the family learned to measure time differently, not in hours or days, but in moments of recognition and calm. A passing marked not by noise, but by stillness when his final moment arrived. It did not unfold in chaos or confusion, but in a stillness that those present would later struggle to describe. There was no dramatic interruption, no sudden shift that announced itself clearly. Instead, there was a gradual quieting, as if the room itself had decided to soften its edges. Family members who were present later spoke not of spectacle, but of presence. The sense that what was happening was both deeply personal and strangely peaceful. Grief did not arrive immediately in full force. It came in waves that would only become heavier with time. In the immediate aftermath, there were practical considerations, quiet conversations, and moments of disbelief that delayed emotional processing. Yet beneath everything, there was an awareness that something foundational had changed permanently. The figure who had once filled rooms with certainty and voice was no longer physically there, but his influence remained embedded in the space he left behind. The envelope that carried more than instructions in the days following the private farewell. The family gathered to address matters left behind. Among them were personal letters, carefully prepared and stored for a moment he would not witness. These were not documents of wealth distribution in the conventional sense, but reflections, acknowledgments, and final words intended for those closest to him. Each letter carried a distinct tone, shaped by the relationship it addressed. Some were reflective, others instructive, and others still carried the weight of unfinished conversations, stretched across a lifetime. The emotional impact of these writings did not come from surprise alone, but from recognition, the realization that they contained not just farewell, but understanding. For the family, reading them meant confronting not only loss, but the full complexity of their shared history. The room in which they were opened became a space of silence, interrupted only by the turning of paper and the occasional breaking of composure. A legacy written through work, struggle, and belief to understand the emotional weight of what was left behind. One had to revisit the long arc of his life. Before recognition, before public attention, there was only work shaped by necessity and persistence. His early years were defined by hardship, resourcefulness, and a relationship with land and survival that influenced everything he later built. Over time, what began as small-scale effort evolved into something far larger, driven by family participation and a shared sense of direction. Success did not arrive as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual expansion of what had already been in motion. Yet even as visibility increased, the core values he held did not significantly shift. His world, remained consistent, shaped by discipline, faith, and personal conviction. For his family, the inheritance was not simply material. It was the continuation of a narrative that had begun long before public attention ever existed. Fame, tension, and the weight of being known, public recognition, brought both opportunity and complexity. What had once been a private family enterprise became a widely recognized cultural presence. Attention amplified every aspect of their lives, including beliefs, disagreements, and public interpretations of identity. The visibility created admiration in some circles and criticism in others, often simultaneously. Within the family, navigating this attention required adjustment, particularly as external perceptions sometimes clashed with internal realities. While some embraced the spotlight, others struggled with its intensity. The experience of being widely known did not simplify life, it added layers to already existing dynamics. Over time, fame became less about novelty and more about endurance, learning how to remain grounded while constantly being observed. Despite this, the family continued to operate with a shared understanding that their foundation remained rooted in relationships rather than reputation. The private weight of public memory as time passed. The public narrative surrounding the family began to settle into simplified versions of a much more complex reality. What remained visible were highlights, controversies, and cultural associations, while the quieter, more personal aspects of their lives remained largely unseen. Within the family itself, however, memory was far more layered. It included hardship, reconciliation, growth, and contradiction. The passing of their patriarch became a moment where these layers briefly converged. Public attention did not fully capture the internal experience of loss, which remained deeply private. In conversations among themselves, the focus was less on legacy as perceived externally and more on lived experience, the accumulation of shared years that could not be easily summarized. This distinction between public memory and personal memory became especially pronounced during moments of reflection. The closing of an era and what remains after with time. What remained was not a single defining image, but a collection of impressions. Resilience, complexity, conviction, and contradiction, existing side by side, the family continued forward, carrying both responsibility and memory. Roles adjusted again, not through announcement but through necessity. Life resumed its forward motion, though it did so differently than before. There was no single moment of closure, only a gradual recognition that an era had ended and another had begun. What persisted was not absence alone, but influence. The way decisions, habits, and perspectives continued to reflect what had been passed down. In that sense, the story did not conclude so much as it transformed. What remained was not just what had been left behind, but what continued through those still living it, a family learning to carry what cannot be replaced in the quiet that followed. The family found themselves adjusting not only to absence, but to continuity shaped by memory. Conversations still carried echoes of the past. Decisions still referenced guidance once given, and daily life still reflected patterns established long ago. Grief did not erase structure, it reshaped it. Over time, the intensity of loss softened into something more enduring: remembrance without immediacy, presence without physical form. The family's challenge was no longer about processing a single event, but about integrating a lifetime of influence into the future they were building. In that sense, what had ended externally continued internally. And while nothing could replace the figure they had lost, what remained ensured that the story was far from over.